Okay, welcome back. I'm Cappadocia. Welcome back to Plane Facts, where we pick apart what we're flying in World of Warplanes and see what they did right and where they went wrong, and give a bit of history on the aircraft itself. So, today we're looking at the Bristol Blenhiem, specifically the Mark IV that you have in the game. And I'm going to end up jumping on my little hobby horse at the end here, but we'll get to that. So, the Mark IV, well, the Bristol Blenheim started off. It was designed as a few things. So it was a medium bomber, night fighter, and a recon plane. It first flew in 35, known as the Type 142 at that point, and it did well. So the ordered a few, but it was only actually in use during World War II for the first 2 years. It ended up being a trainer, so yeah, not a problem with that. It carried on being used, but it wasn't a bad plane really. It started design in 33, first flew in 35. Used the Bristol Aguila engine, so you're looking at 500 horsepower per engine, so it had two of them, so not too bad there. By the time it came through though, especially at the start of the war, it was known to be pretty quick at the start, but it wasn't great. I mean, let's be honest. The Blenheim, it wasn't the greatest plane ever developed. But it didn't do too bad. I mean, Bristol were known for making some pretty good aircraft. I mean, obviously, the boat, but bits and pieces of the bow fighter. But it was, I mean, so the Mark One was a light medium bomber, well, light bomber, what we call now. The Type 2 was Mark 2 was a recon. 39 is when the Mark 4s came along. What they've done is they've stripped out the fuel tanks from the aircraft and replaced the engines to start off with Mercuries. Started for the 8 and the 9. It wasn't bad, so but it was replaced by the bow fighter, and it was dropped down to being a trainer. It had a little, the dorsal turret on the back, which could actually be the little dorsal turret which you can see on the aircraft in the game, but it was actually slightly retractable. The idea being that it could be lowered a little bit to reduce drag, so the plane could go a little bit faster. It did have its single Browning 303 in the front and Lewis gun in the back in the semi-retracting turret. Eventually that was replaced by a Vickers VGO, and it could carry about 1,000 pounds of bombs. I think 1,000, yeah, something like that. And we bungee cords at that point to keep the bloody doors shut. And basically you drop the bomb on it, the bomb opens the door. That was how it worked, which led to a lot of inaccuracy, because when it hit, you could never quite be sure when the door would open, whether it would open instantly or whether it would just slowly push through, depending on how pointy, how strong the bungee cords were. It was, it flew missions over during the war as well, but it was quickly rendered obsolete very, very rapidly. Where it was transferred into a trainer. It was originally, it was still used. I mean, 41 was, I think, one of its last ones. It was updated into a fighter variant, used all over the place. Not just as a heavy fighter, but as a light bomber as well. Anywhere that wasn't really going to be battling German aircraft, so it was used all sorts of places. Even the Finns got hold of it. They sold it to Finland, which is but we sold under we sold them, then they made them under license, but they took the bomb bay doors off as unnecessary embuggerance, and so just dropped it straight, which increased the range, well, the accuracy and indeed capacity a little bit. Now the interesting one here, this is the Type Mark IV, or the Type 4, which is the one we used in the game here. It was also known as the Blenhiem book, but it was had protective armour and a slightly extended nose. It was using Bristol Mercury 15 radial piston engines. One gun in the port wing, which was the Browning, 2 machine guns in the dorsal turret, and yeah, it also had 2 remote underneath the nose, so they're not in the game either. And yeah, it could carry about 1,000 pounds of bombs, and also it could carry smaller incendiaries and explosives on hard points under the wings, but again, they're not in the game. So its maximum speed was about 266 mile an hour, so that's what, a 425? 420 odd kmh. So, you know, wasn't a bad little plane, really, to start with. But it was very, very quickly outdone by new planes that were coming along, such as the Beaufort, the Beaufighter, which basically with the same airframe modified a little bit, the old Whispering Death, and the Blenhiem itself, which came along, an updated variant, changed a lot of things in the plane. Yeah, but for the early part of the war, it wasn't bad, it wasn't great, it wasn't going to win any prizes for beauty contests, let's be honest, but it did okay. It certainly did okay. Now, so in the game, where this is a Type 4, it should have the 2 chin guns, it doesn't have those, so it should have an extra bit of firepower and the hard points. But the bit I'm going to jump on, this is my hobby horse. This is the bit that annoys me the most, is why is this the only British bomber in the game? And why is it a premium plane? Well, it was standard part of the British setup, and the whole mentality of the RAF going into World War II was which is where most of these planes are from. When you look at the majority of the planes, there's a few from just after, a few from just before, but the majority of them, they're World War II fighter aircraft. So, the question becomes, when the British mantra was the bomber will always get through, why is this the only bomber we've got for British aircraft? I mean, without going into like ridiculous levels, I mean, you had the, you know, let's have a look, the Handley Page Hampton. That would have been a pretty good one to start. The Handley Page biplane bomber. That wouldn't have been a bad one for an early one to go in with the category 2s. That would have been alright. You had the de Havilland Mosquito was a bomber. There was a bomber variant of that. So why is that not in the game? I mean, the Mozzie itself is here, so why is that not in there? You could even, hell, the Mozzie could be, we haven't even got any ground attacks apart from the Werroway, which we'll come to another time, but, yeah, the Mosquito did that as well, realistically. I mean, you have to modify the, was it the Werry version, which had 12-pounder pom-pom gun strapped to the front for hunting submarines. So why was that, you know, we haven't got any ground attacks either. So, I mean, I mentioned 3, I mean, I could go further. You know, the Handley Page Halifax. You know, you had, there was the Westland Lysander, a short takeoff plane which was mostly used for smuggling operations in France. That also had a light bomber variant. You have, you know, and that's without getting into like the Avro Manchester, the Avro Lancaster, and then even if you want to push just beyond the end of the wall, the Avro Shackleton and even the Vulcan V bomber. These were all planes that would fit perfectly in with World of Warplanes, but they're just not there. And for the life of me, I don't understand why. The whole RAF was built around, well, the bombers weren't great, but they were there, and they were designed to be the best bombers we could make at the time. And not being funny, but I would personally say that the Lancaster, the Avro Lancaster, was probably the best bomber of the war. It was designed specifically for night intrusions, so You know, it wasn't going to be daylight bombing, so it didn't need the huge amounts of armaments that the B-17 carried, but it had a bigger bomb bay and a smaller silhouette. So it was harder to spot, and it carried more explosives than the B-17. B-17's in here, hell, even the B-32's in here, which would have been the equivalent of the Shackleton. Well, there was an in-between what they called the Super Lane, but that's neither here nor there. But why are there no other British bombers other than this one? And, you know, the British bombers were an integral part of the war, and pre-war, and hell, World War One. I mean, like I said, with the Handley Page biplane bomber, these are great aircraft for their day, but they don't make any appearance at all, and I think that's a bit poor, to be honest. There are plenty of British bombers that could easily have been made. Like I said, the Handley Page Hamden, the flying suitcase as it was known, because it was so narrow and thin. That would have been perfect for some of the early, you know, Class 3, Class 4 would have been perfect. The Halifax a little bit later on. The Avro Manchester, which was the what would eventually become the Lancaster after a few upgrades. Other things you don't know, Handley Page at this point, with the Halifax, their main designer was a guy called by the name of Barnes Wallis, who developed the Mountain Bomb as well. So he had this thing about geodesic aircraft design, which basically instead of using struts, he used like small hexagonal chunks to maintain the basically almost like chicken wire, just a bit thicker to maintain the whole. Obviously it's not, but simplifying, but to keep the rigidity of the structure rather than relying on spars, he took the idea from hot air balloons, Zeppelins. So, you know, these are all perfectly good aircraft, and they would have done such a good job in this game. But for some reason, the designers just decided to completely ignore Britain's bomber wing. And, you know, I mean, alright, we didn't really use ground attack aircraft per se. Most of ours were multi-roles, you know. In the game, they would have been considered multi-roles rather than ground attack. There were a couple. But Britain's whole bomber fleet just completely ignored. I think it's a bit of a travesty. We produced some, you know, obviously the Germans made their name with Luftwaffe, but then the whole ethos was very different behind the Luftwaffe with their bombing setup and the British setup. The British setup was designed for strategic strikes. The Luftwaffe was more designed as a close support, so it was designed to fly over, flatten things behind, where the RAF was designed to be a standalone unit and fight in the air and bomb strategic areas. We're not talking like, not talking just behind the lines raids. We're not talking about like small targets, because bombing accuracy, even with the bomb sites that would come later, they weren't really as accurate as all that. So you're not talking about, you know, the Americans like to claim that their bomb site could drop a bomb in a pickle barrel, but let's be honest, no, that was never going to happen. Not with any of them, mostly because a lot of it was guesswork. But, you know, you set speeds, things like that, but you had to time everything, and even then, you know, you didn't know what the wind conditions are underneath the plane, so, you know, you don't have on-board weather, so you're never going to be that accurate. But the American bombers are in it, the German bombers are in it, even though, like I said, a lot of German bombers were designed just to strike behind the lines. The American bombers were designed for carpet bombing. British bombers were designed for night attacks. They were designed to be operating on individuals rather than in big wings. Yes, we did send out bombing groups occasionally, you know, but more often than not, it would only be a couple. And they were designed to target specific areas. So the Americans come over, just carpet bomb the area. We go over, target very specific. So we're talking, you know, factories. We're talking marshalling yards, equipment dumps, things like that, and obviously famously the Mosquito with its raid on Berlin when Hermann Göring was doing a radio transmission on his birthday. Came in, decided to knock down a few bits and pieces around him. So again, you know, the Mosquito was a light bomber with a bomb bay inside. Those particular versions were unarmed, so it relied purely on its speed and nothing being able to catch it to be able to get in the air again. So again, I do wonder why the entire British bombing wing was left off. Whether it was just because the developers decided that they didn't know many British bombers, but then you've got Google. It's not that hard to look them up. Yeah. It's crazy to me that they're not there. Like I said, British bombers were a mainstay throughout the war. So, you know, we produced a lot of them. Some very good variants, some very good planes, and we've got some weird sort of examples of other aircraft, but yet no British bombers. I wish I could work that one out, but I can't. But anyway, I think I'm going to leave that one there now. So again, thanks for your time, and I'll leave you to enjoy the rest of the flight. But for the minute, I've been Cappadocia, signing off.